Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our topics 5.8 and 5.16. So remember, right, Unit 5 is all about land and water use, which we've now talked about at length. We now have to continue, though, our discussion on how we specifically use resources. And in 5.8 and 5.16, this is how we specifically use resources that come from the ocean, right? Specifically, fish. Right, we know that not only are crops like vegetables, fruits, and so on, as well as raising cattle, right, pigs, and whatnot, are a part of our diets. Lots of areas around the world highly depend upon then the fish populations and fish within their diets. Now, we've talked about overfishing before in the very beginning of the year when we discussed Tragedy of the Commons, right? We did our whole fishing lab, and we saw that if there weren't really any rules or regulations put into place, we saw that for the most part, each group kind of depleted their pond in the end, which is pretty much what we kind of see in real life, especially in the ocean. Now, we know that overfishing, right, has led to an extreme scarcity of some specific fish species. When we lessen those numbers of fish species, we know that we're going to eventually lessen the biodiversity in that aquatic system. Thinking back to Unit 2 topics, right, we know that when we lessen the biodiversity of a given ecosystem, it makes it far more vulnerable to some sort of disturbance. We also know that the less and less fish that we see, the more it's going to harm then the human population, as well as the then economy or commerce of that given area that's going to really depend upon those fish populations. So, overfishing can not only impact the ecosystems, but it also can harm human populations in terms of economics. Now, some fishing techniques I have displayed here in this picture. You don't necessarily need to know each and every one of these. But the main piece to this that you do want to know is that when certain fishermen use specific techniques, things like maybe long lining or drift nets, and just certain types of fishing techniques that are going to catch more than what might be intended, is usually the techniques that we want to try to avoid. Now, when fishermen actually catch what is not necessarily the target species, we call that bycatch, right? So that is the unintended species being caught. So that's things like dolphins, whales, and turtles potentially being caught in these very large nets and being harmed by this then technique. Some other techniques that we might see that are incredibly harmful is actually called bottom trawling. It's something that's not done very often anymore, but when it was done, it's really harmful because it's actually taking a very large net and it drags it along the ocean floor. What that does is it stirs up all of the ocean sediment, so it's going to increase the turbidity of the ocean and potentially destroy any coral reef structure since they depend upon the light that penetrates through. This can also decrease the biodiversity by killing any non-target species caught in that net, and it removes simply any of that coral reef habitat, which we know a lot of organisms depend upon for their survival. So it's important to know that specific fishing techniques such as bottom trawling, long lining, or even using large nets are going to be very detrimental in terms of the ecosystems around them. Now, one method that we've now implemented more of to try to help mitigate the issues of overfishing and other fishing techniques is the introduction of aquaculture. Now, aquaculture is basically when we tend to actually raise fish species in almost like a farm type setting, like we would just with cattle. Some of the pros to aquaculture is it can be incredibly efficient, right? We're producing a lot of fish in a very high quantity with not taking up as much space. Also, doesn't require any fuel, right? You don't have to actually go fuel up a boat and actually go out and fish, right? Your fish are pretty much right there along the shoreline. And it tends to require small areas of water. As you can kind of see in the images here, this aquaculture farm is kind of along the shore here. Now, some cons of aquaculture, when we raise fish in these very close quarters with one another, it does have the ability to contaminate any wastewater, since all the fish are going to be producing waste. We can also see some of the farm raised fish can actually escape their enclosure. And when that happens, they can end up competing with then wild fish, and maybe even carry some diseases or parasites like sea lice. We can also see that simply just the density of the fish is going to lead to an increase in disease. So, really similar to when we talked about meat production and the fact that we have to use lots of antibiotics on the cattle that live in such close quarters with one another, the same kind of concept applies here in aquaculture, right? The fish live very close to one another, so it can increase the incidence of disease spread. And if those then farm raised fish end up escaping, they may even infect a wild fish population as well. Now, although aquaculture does have some cons, it is certainly a good method to begin to implement more of in order to decrease the pressure of overfishing on wild fish populations. All right, everyone, this is it for this video. Be ready tomorrow, however, to discuss more of these fishing techniques and aquaculture.